Unvarnished Arkansas tells the story of 9 different people from Arkansas. They weren't all born here, but they all lived here and they were all part of the story of Arkansas. For example, Sidney Wallace. His story is fascinating because there's 3 different interpretations of it, 3 different ways of explaining it. Now, Sidney lived about 100 miles upstream here in the Arkansas River in a city called Clarksville. And he was 12 years old during the Civil War, when his father, Vincent Wallace, a Methodist minister, had visitors on the last day of the year, 1863. And nobody knows what they said to him, but they shot him and killed his father. So Sidney's 12 years old, he's got no father, and his mother is now raising him and his brothers, along with the help of their former slave, their still family servant, Missouri Blackguard. And according to one version of the story, the Wallace boys just ran wild. And after the war ended, it was still lawless out in western Arkansas, and they were just basic outlaws. And there was a shooting of a traveling salesman outside of Clarksville. And his companion came into town and he said it was those Wallace boys again. So they went out, and Sidney was the one they picked up and brought into town to charge with the shooting, attempted robbery. And at that point, the jail had been burned down during the war, so they put Sidney in the 2nd floor of a downtown building, and he just kicked out the window, jumped out onto a roof of a shed, and escaped. And that's when the shootings really started in Clarksville. The constable was shot dead, the county judge was shot dead, and everybody around town was saying it's those Wallace boys again, but there are no witnesses. Finally, one man stepped forward and said, "I saw Sid in ambush waiting for the constable." So they went out to arrest him again, surrounded the family house outside of town, and according to legend, Sidney escaped under the skirts of Missouri Blackguard, the family servant. And they finally ran him down and captured him in another town and brought him back to Clarksville, had a trial, convicted him of the earlier shooting of the salesman and the shooting of the constable. And while Sidney was in prison and the case was under appeal, there was one day that he was up in that 2nd floor, and by this time they had armed guards watching over him. He saw the one man who had testified that he had seen Sidney waiting in ambush. So Sidney grabbed the rifle of one of his guards, pointed it out the window, and shot the man who testified against him, killed him dead in the city streets. So Sidney ended up in the state penitentiary here in Little Rock. The case was under appeal, went to the state Supreme Court, and they didn't want to hear the case. The family begged the governor to give a pardon to Sidney, and the governor didn't want to pardon him. And so on March 1874, Sidney was finally hanged for those murders. Now, the legend of Sidney Wallace grows from there, because some people say he wasn't an outlaw. Some people say he was just hunting down the men who killed his father, because they say that his servant, Missouri Blackguard, had shielded Sidney when he was 12 years old, and he couldn't see the people who killed his father. And she said she wasn't going to tell him who they were until he was 21 years old. So 9 years later, that's when the shootings start, and people say all he was doing was hunting down the murderers of his father and executing justice on them. So there's a second version of the story that makes him pretty much of a noble hero fighting for what was right. Sidney never agreed to either version of the story. In the courtroom and in the prison cell talking to reporters, he consistently said that he had not shot any man except in self-defense. In fact, he claimed that he was sick in bed with the measles when the constable and the judge were shot. And that's what his mother testified, and that's what Missouri Blackguard testified. But we don't know. We've got all 3 versions of the story, and we don't know which one to believe.